Hi folks, you're with Tacitus today at your Pushback channel, and thank you for joining this live stream. In this live chat, I'd like to talk about Karl Marx, the great philosopher, social economist, call him what you like, and the life and times that he lived in and the sort of forces that would have shaped his views. It goes without saying that whether you agree with Marx or not, that the shadow he casts over social economics, even today, 140 years odd after he died, he's still a huge figure in social economic history, and many of his insights and his meticulous examination of capitalism, which was really, industrial capitalism, which was in its earlier days back then. His examination is without doubt a tour de force, again, whether you agree with him or not. So I'd like to talk a little bit about it, because I think there's a number of misunderstandings about Marx. His works have been used as a launching platform for many other revolutionaries and various people in history coming afterwards, including Vladimir Lenin and Leon Trotsky and numerous others in the Chinese Communist state today. They've paid for a statue in Karl Marx in Trier in Germany, and so so even today his writings and his views have resonance. But let's go back to the Karl Marx was born in what today is sort of northwestern Germany, in a town called Trier, and he came from a moderately well-to-do family, and his father was a lawyer and expected young Karl to go into the law business, but so Marx went to university and became a revolutionary, or began to become a revolutionary then. You're getting into the works of Hegel. And even during his childhood, his father had that sort of classic liberal type view of, and this is very Jewish too, that if the world was equal, then Jews would never be, everybody was equal, then Jews would never be victimized again. And that's something that was taught then in Jewish schools and still taught today. And it's an interesting view of sort of, if only everyone else was reorganized and a new society is brought in, then Jews would be safe. So that's not a uniquely Jewish take on things, but the classic view that social outsiders have, that if only society could be reordered, then they could be included in the mainstream, that type of thing. So that was very much so. Marx was brought up on the works of Diderot and Rousseau and Locke and all this sort of stuff. So all the thinkers of the time that were talking about the liberal project. So anyway, that's where Marx was sort of growing up, the sort of influences that he was, the things they would have talked about around the dinner table and that sort of stuff. So he goes to university, and it doesn't work out so well there. His radicalism gets him into trouble, and even though he was looking for a post as maybe a lecturer or an academic, his views were considered too radical in what was the greater Prussian state at the time. Now, we're talking here like 1830s and that around there, and this was a time when the fallout of the French Revolution, liberty, equality, fraternity, all this sort of thing that has spread around Europe, was unrealized. There was a lot of places around Europe where they thought, well, these ideas are good, but this liberty and equality and everything, but it has yet been unrealized on the ground. So there was a degree of agitation and tension there in a lot of societies in Europe about let's fulfill these dreams and utopian ideals of the French Revolution, and so there was, authorities were clamping down on some of that sort of stuff, and including there was some strikes and street marches and so on, and the various groups of people were agitating for these more liberal views and more liberal policies to be implemented. Now, there were a lot of monarchies still around at the time. The Austro-Hungarian Empire was a monarchy, so Austria, Hungary, a lot of what we know, Czechoslovakia or Czech Republic and Slovenia, Slovakia, a lot of these places, they were still under a system of monarchy, and as were the Prussians at the time. Trial by jury was quite rare, for example. But the rules of evidence and due legal process did mostly apply. In France, they tended to slip back, really going back from the revolution, and it was the administration of the king known as Louis Philippe. Now, there were some revolutions around in 1830 and particularly in 1848, and that changed the landscape of a few places. Louis Philippe, the King of France, for example, fled to England to receive political sanctuary there, and there were a number of other monarchs that decided to abdicate or reduce their powers, or to seek the approval of the assemblies and things like that. So there were changes afoot, and there was the clamouring for a new form of government, a new form of society. A lot of this was brought about by the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution, particularly so in Britain. And as the farms became bigger and more efficient, the serf peasant labour that was once needed on the farms wasn't needed anymore. So these people were effectively being booted out, and they were moving to the cities and were starting to be a labour force for the factories. Now, most of the businesses back in the time, and this is where Marx would have come in, most of the industrial businesses were quite small. It was the big multinational companies that we take for granted today didn't really exist back then. It was just somebody who'd designed maybe a new way of weaving fabric, textiles and that sort of thing, or someone that had developed a new way of making pottery or steel work or refining. But it's mostly small entrepreneurs with ideas, and they would or steel work or refining. But it's mostly small entrepreneurs with ideas, and they were taking a big risk. So they built a pretty basic sort of factory, and they would put their machines in there, and they would hire the labourers. And a lot of these labourers were illiterate peasants from the farms and who'd come to the city. So they were being put to work in these things. As you can imagine, there was industrial accidents, things like that. Also, today, before steam and oil-powered machinery was steam engines, as in the steam ships, that the ships were still going on sail. So there was a huge risk in bringing raw materials in, fabrics in, and things like that. Ships getting lost at sea, storms, pirates, all sorts of stuff like that. So it's very high risk business, but the profits were huge. So if the ducks lined up, the ship arrived, the fabric came in, the profits were huge. But in summertime, they were often working, the workers, 10, 11, 12, even 14 hours a day, and not so much in winter where the days are shorter. So it was a time when exploitation, if we can use that, was the worker was an essential part of making a business viable, given the associated and peripheral risks of doing business. In Manchester, as an example, in 1844, Marx met another Jewish guy called Frederick Engels, and Engels had read some of Marx's revolutionary, inflammatory writings, and Marx went on to really be a journalist for most of after he got kicked out of university. He really did journalism most of the time, and mostly working as either a journalist or an editor for revolutionary type newspapers and pamphlets and so on. And he was constantly getting kicked out of one place. He'd get kicked out of Germany, would go to France, kicked out of France, go to Belgium, kicked out of Belgium, go to England. And so he was certainly moving around a lot. England at the time was probably the freest place in terms of rights and liberties and laws and geological process, probably the freest place in Europe, if not the world, but certainly Europe at the time. So Marx was able to stay there for the rest of his life. But when Engels came to meet Marx, Engels' family had a factory in North England. I think it was textiles, and so Engels, although his family were very wealthy industrialists from down in the Rhineland area in Germany, they still had a fairly libertarian view. Again, rather the Jewish view, if the world was equal, Jews would never be persecuted again. Still, the root was always got together, and they, particularly Engels' experience with industry and manufacturing and factories and so on, and he had a bit of a problem with the idea of the workers were living in terrible squalor while the industrialists were doing comparatively better. So that was sort of the architecture, if you like, of the situation. The early days of the factories, the dirt factories. So that was sort of the architecture, if you like, of the situation. The early days of the factories, the dirt floors of the factories, the poor lighting, poor ventilation, machineries that didn't have proper safety covering on them, illiterate peasant workers being made to work long hours. These were the conditions that Marx saw, and this formed the basis for all his writings. Now, times were to change. He was to change. Safety was to change. Working days. There was a whole lot of changes that were going to occur as the concept of the industrial, because it was all new working days. There was a whole lot of changes that were going to occur as the concept of the industrial, because it was all new at the time, the concept of the industrial revolution. Marx was taking a snapshot of the early days of industrial capitalism, and that was the basis for all his writings and prognostications and so on. Now, I in my view, you don't agree with everything he said. He did a very good job. He's very meticulous, very thorough, and he went through all the factors. Whether we look back now and say that he didn't really know the importance of X or Y or A or B, that's another matter. His examination at the time and his wider view of economics and social economics within the capitalist system, I still see it as quite incisive today. I agree with very little of it, incidentally, but I still see it as incisive and a great work, particularly given its time. Now, by the time Engels, who edited most of Marx's manuscripts and papers after Marx had died to produce Das Kapital, which is Marx's seminal work, the times had already changed considerably, and Engels was able to edit that, and Friedrich Engels was able to edit that and change a lot of the views and subtexts and subclauses to edit them to be more representative of a central view that what was about in debtors' prison, for example. So just looking at that, there were some areas that Marx didn't adequately address, I don't believe. But just coming back to the central core of labour value, that if labour value isn't being equitably distributed, then in itself it creates a class divide and a tension within the capitalist system, and that tension, I'm simplifying a bit here because it's a huge subject, would take hours to go through, that tension between the equitable distribution of surplus value, that is where that will boil over into, as Marx would see it, revolution, so that he sees the contradiction while capitalism is focused on making profit, which Marx doesn't per se have a problem with. He says as the profit's produced, someone has to get screwed in the process. It's going to be the worker, and because of that, that will boil over into revolution. Now, Marx raised some other interesting points, that if the worker gets screwed, then on wages, then that worker doesn't have as much to buy the consumer goods that the manufacturer produces. Therefore, less consumer goods are sold because workers have less money, and as a result, the capitalist is then forced to try and reduce wages to make up for the lost market activity from the lower worker, and so then that becomes self-defeating with constantly reducing wages, and then there's less money to spend, therefore the capitalist has to reduce wages again. Then on the other side, in competition, where manufacturers, and Marx assumes they're all chasing the same market with the same product and so on, and the same manufacturing costs, the only way they can survive is by competing on price, and therefore they don't make out of business, and therefore capitalism defeats itself. Flaws in that, but the direction he's going in is you can see it still holds up to some government, but there's not a Marxist government that certainly that I'm aware of that's been a full Marxist state control that's been imposed, or that has risen up anywhere, unless it's by revolution and by imposing it upon a populace, be they willing or not. Now, Marx did touch on this, saying that in order to overthrow the old order, revolution would be required. So Marx did comment on that. But Lenin was probably the first, along with Leon Trotsky, or Levi Bronstein, as he was also known. That was the legal application of it. Now, if you look at whether it be an attempt at Marxist revolution or the imposing of it, it's always been by armed uprising and by civil war. So it's always been imposed at the point of a gun. But the mass migration into the West of the third world peasants that's being organised by the globalist cabal, all coming into the West. They're not trying to shovel them into the small economies. They're shoveling them into the most active economies where they can supply credit and where they can make the most money. So that idea of the capitalism would fail unless people were brought in en masse, millions and millions of people into the economically vibrant Western nations, which means the replacement of the white population. But they're doing that as part of their strategy, as they would see it, to ensure the sort of forces that he was exposed to and that shaped his views. His work is still a great tour de force. So if you're going to read it, and if you're going to read Das Kapital, you'll need to be pretty intrepid to get through it. But if you are prepared to get through it and really put in the time and the legwork, it's worth a read if this is your interested in the subject, because it'll give you a great grounding and understanding to many of the facets of capitalism, and also how capitalism built and developed over time. And maybe before Marx, you could read Hegel and consider Althusser, but look at the Communist Manifesto, and more importantly, Das Kapital, as giving you a very detailed grounding and discipline on how to approach